The U.S. scraps the United Nations nuclear deal with Iran. What next?
It's time for US-UN Report. Here's Tom Osborne.
These are the stories making headlines this week. Lawmakers weigh Plan B to protect Special Counsel Robert Mueller against Republican plans to halt the investigation of the Trump administration. The newly minted Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met with North Korea leader Kim Jong-un, and 3 American prisoners held for years in North Korean torture cells come home to America. The White House continues to deny statements by top communications director Kelly Sadler, who allegedly made fun of Senator John McCain's brain cancer diagnosis, saying he's going to die anyway. The comments came during a meeting the day after Senator McCain announced that he was opposing the nomination of Gina Haspel to be permanent director of the CIA. Hearings are underway. Former mayor and presidential advisor Rudy Giuliani has left his law firm. Some say he was forced out by the firm. He wants to focus on representing the president in Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation of alleged criminal activity in the administration. President Trump's campaign officials tied to Russian oligarchs are one subject. Big money changes hands is another, some say for access to the president. As the GOP effort to force the enforcement of immigration laws gains support, House Speaker Paul Ryan weighs in. The Speaker dismissed an effort by the group of House Republicans to circumvent the normal legislative process and force floor votes on a package of immigration proposals, including separating families. A judge sharply questions warrantless electronic searches at U.S. borders. The judge said it was more intrusive than searches of one person or their effects. Searches of personal electronics, cell phones, and the like are a, quote, substantially heavy burden on travelers' First Amendment rights. Which brings us to our story of the week. The U.S. scraps its agreement with the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council and Germany, withdrawing from the international nuclear deal to keep Iran's weaponization program boxed in. U.S. lawmakers in Iran weigh what is next. Iran has hinted it may stay in the deal with the other 4 nations, Russia, Great Britain, France, and China, members of the Security Council. And so we turn to our resident historian and political scientist, Dr. David Canervo, who will give us the backstory. David?
Thank you, Tom. Iran, also historically known as Persia, was conquered by Muslims in the 7th century A.D. In the early 1500s, the Shiite branch of Islam became the dominant religion. After a series of different ruling groups, the Pahlavi family came to power in 1925. They sought to modernize Iran, but moving the country in that direction, plus the use of the Savak secret police, created much unhappiness among the citizens. The result was the Islamic Revolution in 1979 that brought down the government of Shah Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, who was strongly supported by the United States. The new government consisted of an elected parliament with a president and the Shiite clergy headed by the supreme leader. Following the revolution, Iran became much more isolated from the rest of the world. But in the last decade, reformers in the nation sought to integrate Iran more into the international community through trade and other international agreements, such as the nuclear arms agreement with Europe and the United States, from which the U.S. has just withdrawn. Ken?
Thank you, David. Let's begin with this news clip about the 2012 movie Argo, which depicted the 1979 American hostages hidden by the Canadian Embassy.
Argo, a little-known story made popular by one of the most celebrated films of 2012. It's November 4, 1979. The United States is plunged into an international standoff that brings the country to the brink of war. Iranian revolutionaries overrun the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Dozens of Americans are taken hostage. But 6 diplomats managed to elude capture and hide out with Canadian embassy staff. The CIA devises one of the most elaborate and audacious rescue operations ever undertaken.
This was a very high-level request. The president himself made the final decision for me to launch into Tehran.
The plan would require fake IDs, a phantom movie production, and nerves of steel.
It was one of the great deception operations because the CIA fooled the world.
This is the true story behind the movie Argo, told by the people who lived it.
I was very fortunate to have met one of the people who lived it. That would be Ken Taylor, who was the ambassador of Canada, who actually hid two of them at least in his home, and the others in the actual embassy. Guys, do you remember the movie Argo?
Yes, I do, Ken.
Yes.
And at the time, it was probably one of the strongest films of 2012. But one of the emphasis I want to make is Ken Taylor said to me, as a Canadian, he said, the CIA came in almost like the cavalry at the end, and they're perceived by the film as the main rescuers. But he said it was very much a Canada-U.S. joint effort. Were you aware of that, Tom Osborne?
Well, I figured the U.S. was backing it and that they were part of the deal. It just seemed to flow, obviously, but there was nothing, as you say, nothing overtly stated. It was a very a quiet move, but very, very forceful.
Dr. Canervo, do you want to give us a little backstory on the 1979 American hostages?
Well, of course, what happened was that after the revolution had succeeded and Ayatollah Khomeini was in power as the supreme leader, a group of student demonstrators rushed and seized the American embassy in Tehran and took as hostages 52 Americans who were working there. The hostages were blindfolded and in some cases tied up and restrained in other ways. And what the students were demanding was that the United States return to them the Shah of Iran, Shah Reza Pahlavi. He was in the United States, as I recall, for cancer treatment. But the United States refused to do that. And so despite the negotiations, the hostages were held for 444 days. There had been a rescue attempt by President Carter that went terribly wrong with equipment failures. And finally then the hostages were released on Inauguration Day of Ronald Reagan in 1980. As he was inaugurated, the hostages themselves were being released. Ken?
Well, and now, as I recall, they were snuck out as a film crew. So it was really a very daring, obviously film-worthy scenario that they pretended to be a script supervisor, a director and a director of photography. Tom Osborne, do you remember all this?
Oh, yes, Ken, I do. And remember the days that Walter Cronkite counted every day. And remember, that was one more bang on in the administration of Jimmy Carter, who had refused to leave the Rose Garden until the hostages were released. And, of course, this set himself up for, let's say, internment in the Rose Garden because they weren't going anywhere. And this lasted almost till the end of his administration, and proponents of the President Carter would say that the President Reagan had very little to do with it, and that it was long-term work with the Carter administration to bring them home. Ken?
And the CIA and the Canadian government. At this point, though, would you say that Jimmy Carter's failed attempt, talk a little bit about that in our last minute, Tom.
Well, I think the Carter attempt was at a time when he was really seriously hurting. You know, all the news media were down on him for his seemingly feckless handling of the hostages, and it just seemed that the days being numbered made it even worse. You notice there's no numbers now in terms of what's going on in North Korea. We don't do that anymore. But the nation had seriously decided that Jimmy Carter was really not the president that we had hoped him to be. And particularly in this particular crisis, there was almost no way for him to make good on his promises to bring the hostages home, although many say that he did, in the end, fulfill that promise. Ken?
You're listening to USUN Report with Tom Osborne, Dr. David Canervo, and Ken McCaleb. We'll be back right after these messages. Welcome back to USUN Report with Tom Osborne, Dr. David Canervo, and Ken McCaleb. Let's go back in time a bit before the Iran deal was done. U.S. journalist Frank Uciardo interviewed Iran's ambassador Mohammad Kazi about sanctions back then.
Frank Uciardo sat down with Iran's UN envoy for this exclusive interview.
Please raise a hand.
The Security Council vote to increase sanctions on Iran over its suspect uranium enrichment program was not unanimous.
12 votes in favor, 2 votes against, 1 abstention.
Brazil and Turkey, who recently announced a uranium fuel swap agreement with Iran, voted against the resolution, while Lebanon abstained. The U.S. and its European allies sponsored the resolution.
Despite consistent and long-standing demands by the international community, Iran has not suspended its uranium enrichment and other proliferation-related activities.
It's our absolute right, and we will definitely not compromise. Then you cannot put a sword above the head of somebody and then ask him to negotiate and cooperate.
Key elements of the UN Security Council resolution include sanctions that would bar Iran from engaging in any activities related to ballistic missiles or missiles that can carry nuclear warheads. A lot of Western nations contend that by ratcheting up the sanctions, they would force Iran to come back to the negotiating table and stop its enrichment program. Under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, you have certain obligations to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And the agency made statements yesterday saying that they're not satisfied that you have convinced them that your program is strictly for peaceful purposes. How do you respond to that?
Have they been able to prove otherwise, that Iranian nuclear program has had any diversion from the peaceful purposes?
Basically, you're saying is Iran will not build an atomic bomb. Can you say that?
Definitely. Definitely. Even from the religious point of view, from the constitutional point of view, from the military point of view, we do not believe that having nuclear bomb is going to help Iran, is going to empower Iran.
Tom, before we talk about the soundbite we just listened to, during the commercial break, you started to share a story about working with one of the hostages back in 1979. Would you share that with us now?
Yes, actually, we were covering the Fishkill release. There were 3 locations, Fishkill, New York, and I think there was one in somewhere in Michigan and on the West Coast. And our particular hostage, it could have been any one of the 3 that could be released at the time. And this was later when they released the remaining of sanctions. The remaining hostages. There were 3 left. And so I was one of my first stakeout assignments, I believe, and so I set up a lawn chair in the parking lot of the apartment where the hostage's mother lived, and there was no one else there. I guess everybody figured the West Coast or something like that. And so I managed to become good friends. We had a great conversation, and she was very friendly. And of course, at the last minute, they announced it was Fishkill, and there were 400 newsmen there on the doorstep. And I was way in the back with my crew, and I couldn't get near it. And so one of the state troopers pointed out into the middle of the crush at me and said, "You, here." So I became the pool reporter, got the call from the president to his mother, and so it was a great day, and I remember that very well. Ken?
Dr. Canervo, can you explain to our audience today what was this JCPOA Iran deal, and why does President Trump dislike it so much?
JCPOA stands for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was, of course, the agreement for Iran to limit any action toward creating a nuclear weapon. It has, it seems to me, 3 major points to it. Number 1, it says that Iran must limit its enrichment of nuclear fuel, limit the enrichment to a very low level, which is not bomb-grade material. They also must remove some of that uranium stockpile that they have out of the country to another country so that it won't be readily available to Iran. And third, there are international nuclear experts who are going to be allowed into Iran to monitor the compliance of the nation with the agreement. So they're not going to have the fuel for building the weapons, and it will be verified. As Reagan said, trust and verify. What Trump has as a problem with the agreement is this. Number one, the enrichment restriction apparently is only for 8 years. And so there are some critics, such as Trump, who argue that after 8 years that Iran can just simply go ahead and go back to enriching uranium as they could before and build a weapon. Others have said that that's not part of the agreement, that in fact, that while there are 8-year limits on some things, that actually there is a restriction in perpetuity for the building of a bomb. But nevertheless, Trump believes that after 8 years that enrichment can begin again. A second problem is that ballistic missile launches and research on the part of Iran have continued, and he believes that these should be restricted as well. As we heard in the first clip, there was a resolution against Iran testing and having ballistic missiles, but nevertheless, they have continued on that path to develop them. And a third point, which Trump has a lot of problems with, is the fact that Iran has continued to be a major supporter of terrorism throughout the Middle East. They have provided a lot of money. Some of that money, of course, was received from the United States as one of the agreement deals. So that when we signed the agreement with Iran, they got, as Trump would call it, a plane load of money. It was a couple of $2 billion, I believe, back, which they were to use for things such as economic development in the country. But nevertheless, it appears some of that money, at least as Trump sees it, has been diverted to the support of terrorism. So those seem to be the major problems. There is disagreement, as I've mentioned, on whether the interpretation of those agreements is correct or not on the part of Trump. But nevertheless, that's the way he sees it, and what he wants is a stronger deal, one in which the country of Iran would be forbidden forever from building a nuclear weapon, and that would be more easily controlled. Ken?
My research actually has the number, the monetary number, closer to $100 billion. Not all just cash out like in a suitcase, but in the unfreezing of assets. Now, when it comes to Iran and the West, the relationship has been convoluted for decades, and this deal was no different. Tom Osborne, it's complicated politics coupled with complicated science, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's you've got the formula. And I think the major part of that, of course, under the Obama administration was the U.S. Congress. Obama went ahead because he believed he was right, and we'll say more about what those reasons were. But he did not have the U.S. Congress behind him. Many thought that the plan was flawed, and instead of a unilateral deal between Obama and our allies, it should go through Congress and eventually produce a treaty which is binding. Well, that said, we've already paid Iran, as you said, $100 billion with sanctions relief. Our allies are standing with us shoulder to shoulder up until we pulled out of the deal. So what does withdrawing have to do with the United States? We'll answer that question, I guess, when we come back, Ken.
Well, before we leave, I just want to point out that the United States launched a nuclear program with Iran back in 1957. And back then, the Shah ruled Iran, and the two countries were still friends. Well, you're listening to USUN Report with Tom Osborne, Dr. David Canervo, and Ken McCaleb. And we're talking about the Iran deal, the JCPOA deal gone bad. We're up against a hard break, but we'll be back right after this.
Welcome back to USUN Report. I'm David Canervo, along with Tom Osborne and Ken McCaleb, and we're talking about the failed Iran plan for controlling nuclear weapons that the United States has withdrawn from. Ken?
Thank you, David. Here's an audio clip from a group of well-known figures in both politics and Hollywood. It's quite a contrast of opinions and sound bites.
We're not actually worried about Iran dropping a nuclear weapon on the United States.
Holy is that?
Yes, Jack, it's me, Queen Noor from Jordan.
Look, it is true that if Congress sabotages this deal, there would be nothing stopping Iran from getting the bomb. That would likely spark an arms race throughout the region.
Precisely, Ambassador Pickering.
Ultimately, we could be forced into a war with Iran, another dangerous, drawn-out, and expensive conflict in the Middle East with many lives lost.
So wait, are you saying that instead of a quick toasting type of death, that in a war with Iran, maybe a lot of people would die much more slowly? Like if they were put into, say, an immense crock pot for a really, really long time?
Natasha, I don't think you need a surrealistic food metaphor to comprehend the sheer recklessness of a war with Iran. Once the war begins, the chances of Iran developing a nuclear weapon would only increase.
Wait a second. That's Valerie Plame. Valerie Plame is in this living video. Valerie, do you know that because you're a spy?
Now, David, can you explain some of the dynamics from what we've just heard? I mean, we've heard quotes from Queen Noor of Jordan, Jack Black, Ambassador Thomas Pickering, Morgan Freeman, and Valerie Plame. I'm not sure who Natasha was in that clip. David?
Ken, it seems to me that what they're doing is talking about some of the implications of a failed treaty which would limit the nuclear weapons which Iran may or may not try to develop. The fear is, of course, that without the agreement, there will be increased tension between the United States and Iran, and that increased tension could very well lead to armed conflict and, if not an all-out war, certainly a limited war between the two nations. The Middle East is already, some would argue, a tinderbox of conflict ready to erupt, and so a shooting war between Iran and the United States would simply embroil us that much more into the Middle East, put much more strain on our military, with the fact that we've got them in Iraq and Afghanistan already, and some in Syria as well, so that it would lead to a broader, much more dangerous situation. Ken?
Tom Osborne, Ambassador Thomas Pickering, we've had him on the show now several times, and he said a lot more. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, Ambassador Pickering has always been a very careful and quiet ambassador and doesn't come out to announce the results of the Security Council consultations on a platter, but he's very much to the point, and he has been very critical of the lack of diplomacy that we've seen over the last several years. And he would be, I think, and this is my opinion, he would be asking the question, what does withdrawing do to the United States? And that was his job during the first Gulf War when he steered us with President George H.W. Bush through the Gulf War and Saddam Hussein and so on. On balance, what does it do to the United States? Nothing much good. I could quote Richard Hawes, who is president of the Foreign Relations Council. He says that it reinforces that we are something of a rogue country. We do not honor or live up to our international commitments. It potentially creates a nuclear crisis with Iran when, rumor has it, we've already got a nuclear crisis with North Korea. It does not help us that the president is not acting with the world around us. There was no reason to do this now. And Mr. Haas goes on to say that the president seems to be saying with his actions and his words in this crisis that Iranian non-compliance with this agreement, that was not the issue. What he's saying is it is possible down the road that Iran, consistent with the agreement, could begin to put into place the prerequisites of a new nuclear weapons program, as David suggested. It would have the option to do that in 10 or 15 years. If that turns out to be right, if we were to turn out to be true, we would then have the option to respond to Haas stresses. And let me just point this out very quickly. There was no reason to make the American response to blow up the agreement now. What we are more likely to see is a crisis with our European allies over sanctions at this point, which will further isolate the United States and rip the fabric of our most important alliances, while Iran might be in a position where We are the issue, that is the United States, rather than Iran's behavior. Ken?
Now, Iran is not the only nation with a nuclear program. I mean, there are 8 nations that are known to have nuclear weapons, including all the P5 countries. Nearby Israel has always declined to confirm whether it has any, although the Federation of American Scientists estimates that it has about 80 atomic weapons. But since the 1979 revolution, concerns have escalated that Iran could enrich uranium and make atomic weapons. And Iran has maintained its nuclear program is only for peaceful purposes. Now, Dr. Kanerva, why have the other nations not faced this much scrutiny?
It seems to me that the scrutiny which is being leveled against Iran is because of the tensions which really have existed with that country going back to the 1950s. In 1953, the United Kingdom and the United States were responsible for a coup which led to the overthrow of their elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. His overthrow was because he had nationalized Iran's petroleum industry. That led to a lot of resentment against the United States from Iran, as you might expect, because we put in place Shah Pahlavi as our guy to take control of the country and essentially do our bidding. Not only was he our guy, but he also used the secret police to engage in a great deal of violence against his own people in that country because of their disagreements with what he was doing. So over the years, of course, that resentment against the United States built up. We saw it then occur in the Revolution of '79, the hostage-taking at the American Embassy, which we are still angry about. And so what we have seen then is essentially 60 or 65 years of increasing tension between the Iranian people and the United States, and we are determined that we're not going to let the new Islamic government get away with thumbing their nose at us and also moving ahead in nuclear weapons. One other thing I might add is that, very quickly, is that, of course, the Islamic government has threatened to wipe the Israeli nation off the face of the earth. Israel is a strong ally of ours, and we don't want to see that happen.
Well, Tom Osborne, for nations like India and Pakistan, no action was taken, partly because they never signed the treaty on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, have they?
Well, that's true. And in fact, India is a very big part of this deal. You really can't discount any of the other nations that were part of the deal from the beginning. Some think that withdrawing from the deal inevitably could draw us more into this region, and I think that's part of the stand that critics are taking. And that was exactly what Obama had in mind. He wanted to bring us into the region. He wanted to facilitate the battles that we had going with Iran, and he thought that we could bring them into the Western corridor. But this apparently has now been cut short. And in the process, we've let a lot of the people who were strongly supporting us have to explain themselves and why they did that. Ken?
Well, the deal we just walked away from had Iran reduce its enrichment of 20%. Most of its uranium was enriched at 20% before the deal, and they agreed to reduce it down to 5%. Dr. Kanerva, did they keep up their end of the bargain?
Well, the inspectors who have visited Iran said that was in fact the case, that they were complying with the treaty. And of course, enrichment of uranium at 5% makes it much, much lower than is needed for bomb-grade material. So they did seem to be in compliance. Ken?
You're listening to USUN Report with Tom Osborne, Dr. David Kanerva, and Ken McCaleb. We'll be back right after this, so stay with us.
Welcome back to U.S.-UN Report. I'm Tom Osborne with Ken McCaleb and Dr. David Canervo. And we're talking about the death of the Iran deal on nuclear weapons. And talking about the commitments of Obama and the previous administration and what we're going to do in the future. Ken?
Thanks, Tom. Here's some reactions from around the world. Among them, Benjamin Netanyahu, Stefan Dujarric of the United Nations, DPI, Department of Public Information, and he's also the spokesman for the Secretary General, and the European High Commissioner Federica Mogherini.
Israel fully supports President Trump's bold decision today to reject the disastrous nuclear deal with the terrorist regime in Tehran.
The Secretary General is deeply concerned by today's announcement. The Secretary General has consistently reiterated that the JCPOA represents a major achievement in nuclear non-proliferation and diplomacy. It is essential that all concerns regarding the implementation of the plan be addressed through the mechanisms established in the JCPOA. The Secretary General calls on other JCPOA participants to abide fully by their respective commitments.
The nuclear deal with Iran is crucial for the security of the region, of Europe, and of the entire world. I'm particularly worried by the announcement tonight of new sanctions. The nuclear deal with Iran is the culmination of 12 years of diplomacy. The European Union is determined to preserve it. To the Iranian citizens and leaders, do not let anyone dismantle this agreement. It is one of the biggest achievements diplomacy has ever delivered. Stay true to your commitments as we will stay true to ours.
Tom Osborne, now you've worked with Stefan Dujarric over at ABC. Tell us some of your thoughts of what you just heard.
Well, Stefan was one of the excellent reporters we had on the foreign desk when I was at the UN, and for 3 or 4 years we worked together, hardly, I think, meeting face-to-face, but mostly on the phone. And he certainly knew his foreign affairs and was a very good choice by the Secretary General to be his spokesman. And I know that he's not just the spokesman, but someone who really does understand these issues, and particularly this agreement, because we were talking about it throughout the time I worked at the UN, and he was at ABC. So I'd say that he's right on the money in terms of his understanding and what he had to say. Ken?
Well, what would you say the European reaction is now that the word is out?
Well, actually, I think mostly, as I was suggesting earlier, isolationists are really having their day. Some think that withdrawing from this deal inevitably could draw us more into this region. And that was, in fact, the deal that Obama was trying to accomplish. He was hoping that Iran was going to fill up this vacuum, and in the process that it would change certain behavior and perhaps induce cooperation with the West. And in fact, coordination with the battle on ISIS was also on the table. Some substantial concessions to Iran, of course, seemingly unreciprocated by the critics. Critics say Iran has not changed. Its behavior has become more destabilizing and more aggressive, as we've already talked about, in Iraq, in Lebanon, Syria, and in particular, Yemen. The reason this deal was done now is that we were coming up on another sanctions deadline. I should say the reason the deal was killed is because we've just been coming up on another sanctions deadline, and a decision had to be made. And there were very mixed feelings in Congress, and as we all know, and David, of course, could speak to this, the elections and the primaries that are coming up all have something to say about this, and some are going to be safe, and they're not going to be open-minded about anything in foreign relations that will deter them. But I would say that the argument that Iran was in compliance with this deal is not at issue. It's the fact that Iran can comply with this deal. That was the point. The terms are lenient enough for it to be able to. Nobody has come up with a plan like this before. Critics of this arrangement said that the deal itself wasn't tough enough, didn't attack the means by which Iran could evade inspections. And Israel, as we all saw this past week, demonstrated with its capacity to shield this information of its past nuclear program in a civilian shelter. And that did not have access to military sites. So that The case is the JCPOA was flawed, but could be built upon. Ken?
Well, so much tension between Iran and Israel. It wasn't always this way. After the birth of Israel in 1948, the two nations enjoyed a honeymoon period that lasted until just before the 1979 revolution. And at one point, Israel even supplied weapons to Iran to help it fight their common enemy, Iraq. But the Islamic Revolution that overthrew the Shah marked a turning point. The Islamic Republic, led by Shiite clerics in the predominantly Shiite nation, saw Israel as an illegitimate state with no right to exist, certainly not amid Muslim nations. So years later, Israel began to regard Iran and its support of global terror as a chief threat. Who else is unhappy, Dr. David Canervo?
Who else is unhappy with the scrapping of the agreement?
Who else would be unhappy with the Iranians at this point, nation-wise? Would you say Saudi Arabia is in that group?
Oh, absolutely. Saudi Arabia and other Sunni nations in general. There is a great deal of split between the Sunni and Shiite branches of Islam. They don't like each other at all, and certainly we have seen Saudi Arabia very active in the last 2 or 3 years, both actively fighting against and supplying arms to those who are fighting the Shiites and Iran more specifically. We have seen it in Syria, where in Syria we have somewhat of a proxy situation with Russia and Iran supporting the Syrian regime, which is Shiite, though the most of the people there are Sunni. And we have Saudi Arabia supplying arms to the rebels in Syria. So we have that kind of conflict going on within the Middle East between those two branches of Islam. Ken?
Well, President Donald Trump just made one of the most consequential decisions of his presidency last Tuesday at 2 p.m. when he announced that this was the worst deal ever, and he pulled out. And European allies like France and Germany, who were trying to convince him to stay in, well, they were to no avail. Tom Osborne, where do we go from here?
It's hard to say because I don't think there has been a complete grasp of the panic, the state of panic that allies across the region and Israel. For those who didn't believe that they were in a state of panic over the last 2 years of the Obama administration, this is another shift. And if you line this up with the movement of the embassy to Jerusalem, you now have Israel, Egypt, as David suggested, Saudi Arabia, and the Sunni world all lined up with the United States. Obviously, Syria, Iran, and a lot of our allies across Europe oppose this move, but across the region, more people supported what we did than oppose it. Ken?
Well, Iran gave up 97% of its enriched uranium, and I think part of the deal that Trump didn't like was he wanted to see the uranium shipped to other countries that could be verified, and that wasn't the case. Is there anything else that we're missing, David, that Trump is really upset about?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, he's, of course, upset about the ballistic missile program, which has been continuing. And, of course, rockets were fired at Israel just simply a few hours ago, in exchange with Israel responding. The support for terrorists by Iran has been a major problem for the United States for years. We would be able to have, I think, a more peaceful Middle East if Iran would stop doing that. One of the hopes was with the return of $100 billion to Iran as part of this deal was that money would be used to provide for economic development within Iran. Iran has faced periods of high unemployment, shortages of goods, and the hope was that Iran would try to take care of its own people internally and provide for more peace that way. And that has not happened. Ken?
You're listening to US-UN Report, and we're going to be coming up on a commercial break. But when we come back, we'll discuss and summarize today's program. So stay with us. Welcome back to US-UN Report. And in our final segment, I'd like to offer some conclusive thoughts. So let's hear now from Mary Saliba, our US-UN Report editorialist. Mary?
Thanks, Ken. Now that the United States is out of the Iran nuclear deal, where do we stand in the world? It's hard to imagine how breaking this deal will make us safer. Europe doesn't think so, or Russia, or China. Reimposing sanctions as some kind of punishment while our own intelligence, our allies, and the UN have concluded that Iran has been sticking to the terms of the 2015 agreement shows only that we are not keeping our end of the bargain. The United States, not Iran, has broken the treaty, even as we are trying to plan a summit with North Korea on nuclear disarmament. In advance of this hoped-for discussion with North Korea, 3 hostages were released Wednesday, but we still have at least 5 hostages in Iran. What position have we left them in? If our hope was not simply about the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, but to pressure or break the regime, perhaps we'd have done better by keeping the deal in place and supporting the protests of the large number of working-class Iranians furious about unemployment and cuts to food subsidies, with increased spending on the Revolutionary Guard. Now we've given Tehran ammunition to foster anti-American sentiment as well as an open door to fuel it with nuclear capacity. And we've left ourselves with nothing much to bargain with, especially given that our allies may try to continue upholding the arrangement without us. The EU has billions of dollars of new deals with Iran since the sanctions ended in 2016. Will the U.S. now start penalizing our allies for continuing to do business which we all agreed we could do back in 2015? We have now exited the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Climate Accord, and now the Iran nuclear deal. How can we expect the world to continue to negotiate with us and keep their agreements when we do not? It's difficult enough negotiating with our allies. How can we expect to be able to negotiate with our enemies? This has been Mary Saliba for US-UN Report. Ken?
Now, as for Iran, the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani said on Monday that the deal could survive even without America. If we can get what we want from a deal without America, then we'll continue to remain committed to that deal. Rouhani said that, but what Iran wants is our interests to be guaranteed by non-American signatories, adding that getting rid of the America's mischievous presence will be fine for Iran. Now, that contradicts what Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif said last week when he noted that Tehran would most likely leave the deal if the U.S. did. Well, hopefully none of that will happen, but Dr. David Canervo, your final thoughts?
Well, of course, partly in response to the foreign minister's comments, of course, Trump came back with a real threat that if the Iranian government went on beyond where they are now in the enrichment of nuclear weapons and progress, that of course there would be serious consequences. So he's still threatening. My hope is that the European Union can by itself take care of Iran's concerns and that the deal can still continue with Europe and Iran continuing to work together. I understand Trump's concerns about the missiles, about the support for terrorism. Those things are genuine and are significant. At the same time, there's been no evidence of cheating on the part of Iran, according to the experts. And so it seems to me that the best hope we have is that at least for the time being, we will be able to have some stability brought by a continuation of the agreement. But I don't see additional negotiations involving the United States taking place, at least for the next remainder of the Trump presidency.
Tom Osborne, as always, you have final say.
Well, thank you, Ken David. Well, it's now effectively up to Iran, it seems, and the hardliners we haven't talked too much about will be running the show. And how is the world worse off than it would be with this deal? No good answers. The only answer so far is that this is the fulfillment of a campaign promise. If there was a plan B here, then we would follow that, and we're looking for it. America's waiting for it, and of course the rest of the world as well. I think many would believe, looking at the situation in Iran, that they are economically in a straitjacket. They're going to be facing even tougher sanctions from the United States. But actually, they're not that bad off. They do have a lot of options. And so the sanctions regime is not going to kill them as much as it was. And this is effectively now up to Iran. And we'll find out what happens over the next few weeks, perhaps even the next few days. They're going to have to be watching those centrifuges, but I suspect they're going to start them up again. So I hope you'll join us next week on US-UN Report. I'm Tom Osborne with Ken McCaleb and Dr. David Canervo, and we'll see you then. Thanks for listening.